The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and distant snow through the Dakota territory, whispering secrets that only the old ones remembered. Captain James Morrison stumbled through the wilderness, his Union Army uniform torn and stained with 3 days' worth of sweat and blood. The war was over, had been over for 2 years now, but the ghosts of Gettysburg and Antietam still followed him like shadows that refused to fade. He'd been riding toward the railroad station in Rapid City when his horse had spooked at a rattlesnake and thrown him into a ravine. The fall had left him with a twisted ankle and a head wound that made the world spin in sickening circles. Now he was lost, alone, and running out of water in country that could kill a man in a dozen different ways. The sun was setting behind the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of crimson that reminded him too much of battlefields he'd tried to forget. James pressed on, favoring his injured leg, following what he hoped was a game trail that might lead to water. He'd learned enough woodcraft during the war to know that animals always knew where to find what they needed to survive. That's when he heard it, a sound that made him freeze in his tracks. Singing. Human voices lifted in harmony, but unlike anything he'd ever heard before. The melody was ancient, primal, speaking to something deep in his soul that had been sleeping since the war ended. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like the voice of the earth itself. James followed the sound, moving as quietly as his injured leg would allow. The singing grew stronger as he climbed a rocky ridge, and when he reached the top, he saw something that made him question his sanity. Below him, in a natural amphitheater carved from red stone, a group of Lakota warriors were performing a ceremony unlike anything James had ever witnessed. They moved in a circle around a central fire, their bodies painted with symbols that seemed to glow in the firelight. But it wasn't just the paint that was glowing. The men themselves seemed to radiate a soft, ethereal light, as if they were beings caught between the physical world and some other realm. James knew he should retreat, should slip away before he was discovered. A white man, spying on an Indian ceremony, was asking for torture and death. But something about the scene below held him transfixed. The dancers moved with a grace that transcended the physical, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground. And the singing was like nothing he'd ever heard, voices that seemed to come from the very stones around them. As James watched, one of the dancers suddenly stopped and looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the distance, and James felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond the physical. The dancer was an old man, his face marked with age and wisdom, his long hair white as winter snow. But his eyes were young, ancient, and infinitely sad. The old man raised his hand, and the ceremony stopped. The other dancers turned to look at James, and he realized with a start that they weren't all alive. Some of the figures in the circle were translucent, spirits made visible by whatever power was at work in this sacred place. "Come," the old man said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You have been expected." James wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Instead, he found himself climbing down into the amphitheater, drawn by a force he couldn't understand or resist. The other dancers watched him approach, their faces showing neither hostility nor welcome, only acceptance. "I'm sorry," James said when he reached the edge of the circle. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm lost, and I heard the singing." The old man smiled, and James was struck by the infinite compassion in his expression. "All men are lost, young warrior. Some simply know it sooner than others. You speak English. I speak the language of the heart. You hear what you need to hear." James looked around the circle, taking in the faces of the dancers. Some were young, some old, some scarred by battle, some unmarked by conflict. But all of them carried the same expression of profound sadness, mixed with acceptance. "Who are you?" James asked. "I am Many Horses, keeper of the spirit dance. These are my brothers, some who walk this world, some who have passed beyond. We gather here when the veil between worlds grows thin, when the spirits of the dead call out for peace. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The spirits of the dead? You carry many with you, young warrior. I can see them in your eyes, feel their weight upon your shoulders. They follow you because you have not let them go. James thought of all the men he'd killed in the war, all the faces that haunted his dreams. I don't understand. You will. But first, you must join the dance. I can't. I'm not one of you. Many horses studied him with those ancient eyes. Color of skin means nothing to the spirits. Pain is pain, loss is loss, guilt is guilt. You carry the same burden as any warrior who has taken life in battle. But I'm white. This is your ceremony, your sacred place. The spirits care nothing for the divisions we create in life. In death we are all the same, souls seeking peace, seeking release from the chains we forge with our actions. The old man extended his hand. Will you dance with us, James Morrison of the Union Army? Will you dance for the dead who follow you? James stared at the offered hand, knowing that accepting it would change him forever. He thought of the faces that haunted his dreams, the voices that whispered his name in the darkness. He thought of the weight he'd been carrying since the war ended, the burden that grew heavier with each passing day. What happens if I dance? He asked. You will see the truth of what you carry. You will understand the nature of the bonds between the living and the dead. And perhaps, if you are brave enough, you will find the strength to let them go. James looked around the circle one more time, at the faces of warriors both living and dead, all united in their quest for peace. Then he reached out and took Many Horse's hand. The moment their skin touched, James felt a jolt of energy that seemed to light up his entire being. The world around him shifted, became more vivid, more real. He could see the spirits clearly now, dozens of them, filling the amphitheater with their presence. Some were Lakota warriors, some were cavalry soldiers, some were Confederate infantry. All were united in death, all seeking the same release. Now you see, Many Horses said, now you understand. The old man began to sing, and the other dancers joined in. James found himself moving to the rhythm, his injured leg forgotten, his body responding to music that seemed to come from the earth itself. As he danced, he began to see them more clearly, the spirits of the men he'd killed in battle. There was Private Thompson, the young Confederate soldier James had shot at Fredericksburg. He couldn't have been more than 17, with freckles and red hair that reminded James of his own younger brother. There was Sergeant Martinez, a Mexican-American who'd fought for the Union until James's saber had ended his life during a confused night skirmish. There was Captain Harrison, a Confederate officer who died slowly from a wound James had inflicted during the Battle of the Wilderness. They were all there, dancing in the circle, their faces no longer filled with the pain of their deaths, but with something approaching peace. And as James danced, he began to understand what Many Horses had meant about the bonds between the living and the dead. They don't blame you, Many Horses said, appearing beside him in the dance. They never did. The guilt you carry is your own creation, not theirs. But I killed them, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I ended their lives. You were a soldier doing your duty. They were soldiers doing theirs. In the great dance of life and death, you were all simply playing your parts. James looked at the spirit of Private Thompson, who smiled and nodded as if to confirm the old man's words. Then why do they follow me? Because you won't let them go. Your guilt holds them here, prevents them from finding their rest. They dance with us tonight because they hope you will finally understand. Forgiveness begins with forgiving yourself. The dance continued, and James found himself moving deeper into the trance state that the ceremony created. He could feel the spirits around him, not as haunting presences, but as fellow travelers on the road to understanding. The music seemed to come from within him now, his heart beating in time with the ancient rhythm. As the night wore on, James began to experience visions. He saw the war from the perspective of the dead, saw how the conflict had affected not just the living, but the spirits of those who had passed. He saw the weight of guilt and sorrow that bound the dead to the earth, preventing them from moving on to whatever came next. But he also saw hope. He saw moments of forgiveness, of understanding, of souls finally finding peace. And he began to understand his role in this cosmic dance, not as a killer to be punished, but as a teacher who could help others find their way to redemption. "I was a teacher before the war," James said to many horses during a brief pause in the dancing. "I taught children in a one-room schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. And what did you teach them? Reading, writing, arithmetic, the basics of civilization. And now?" James looked around the circle of spirits, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Now I need to teach them something else. I need to teach them how to forgive, and how to be forgiven," many horses added. The lessons worked both ways. The dance resumed, and James threw himself into it with renewed energy. He danced for Private Thompson, for Sergeant Martinez, for Captain Harrison. He danced for all the men he'd killed, all the lives he'd ended, all the families he'd destroyed. But he also danced for himself, for the man he'd been before the war, for the man he might still become. As dawn approached, James felt a change in the atmosphere. The spirits were beginning to fade, their forms becoming less solid, less defined. But their faces were peaceful now, free of the pain and confusion that had bound them to the earthly realm. "It's time," many horses said. "They're ready to go." James looked at the spirits one last time, memorizing their faces, their expressions of newfound peace. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with surprising strength. "I release you," he said. "I release all of you. Go in peace, knowing that you are forgiven, that your sacrifices were not in vain. Find your rest. Find your peace." One by one, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the morning mist. But as they disappeared, each one turned to James and nodded, their faces shining with gratitude and forgiveness. Private Thompson was the last to go, his young face bright with joy as he finally found his release. When the last spirit had vanished, James collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd experienced. The weight he'd been carrying for 2 years was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace and purpose. "It is done," many horses said, placing a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "You have freed them, and in doing so, you have freed yourself." James looked up at the old man, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you. You thank us by living, by taking what you have learned and sharing it with others who carry the same burden." "How? How do I share this?" Many horses smiled. "You will know when the time comes. The spirits will guide you as they have guided you here." The ceremony was ending, the living dancers beginning to disperse as the sun rose over the Black Hills. James watched them go, these men who had shared their sacred ritual with a stranger, who had given him the gift of healing. "Will I see you again?" James asked. "When you need to," many horses replied. The spirit dance is not bound by time or place. It exists wherever there are souls in need of healing, wherever the living and the dead must find their peace. James nodded, understanding that this was both an ending and a beginning. He had been changed by what he'd experienced, transformed in ways he was only beginning to understand. As he prepared to leave the amphitheater, many horses called out to him one last time, "Remember, young warrior, the dance never truly ends. It continues in every act of forgiveness, every moment of grace, every choice to choose love over hate. You carry the spirit dance within you now. Use it wisely." James made his way out of the sacred place, his injured leg miraculously healed, his head clear for the first time in months. The world looked different now, more vibrant, more alive. He could feel the presence of the spirits around him, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they seemed to offer guidance, comfort, hope. He found his horse waiting for him at the edge of the wilderness, apparently unharmed by its 3-day absence. As he rode toward civilization, James began to formulate a plan. He would return to teaching, but his curriculum would be different now. He would teach not just the basics of reading and writing, but the more important lessons of forgiveness, compassion, and the healing power of letting go. James Morrison arrived in Rapid City just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in those same shades of crimson that had once reminded him of battlefields. But now the colors spoke of something else, of endings that were also beginnings, of darkness that preceded dawn, of the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all life. He sold his horse and used the money to buy a ticket on the next train heading east. As the locomotive pulled away from the station, James looked back at the Black Hills one last time, seeing them not as a hostile wilderness, but as a sacred place where miracles could still happen. The train carried him back to Pennsylvania, back to the life he'd abandoned when the war ended, but he was not the same man who had left. He carried within him now the wisdom of the spirit dance, the knowledge that healing was possible even for the most wounded souls. James found work at a small school outside Philadelphia, teaching the children of farmers and merchants. But his real work began in the evenings, when he would visit the local hospital where wounded veterans were still recovering from their wartime injuries. He would sit with them, these broken men who carried their own ghosts, and he would share what he had learned. He never spoke directly of the spirit dance. That was too sacred, too personal to share with those who wouldn't understand. Instead, he talked about forgiveness, about the weight of guilt, about the possibility of peace. Some of the veterans dismissed him as a fool, a dreamer who didn't understand the reality of war, but others listened. And in their eyes, James could see the same desperate hope he'd felt that night in the amphitheater. These men began to heal, not just their physical wounds, but the deeper injuries to their souls. Word spread, and soon James was traveling throughout the region, visiting hospitals, talking to veterans, sharing his message of healing and forgiveness. He never charged for his services, supporting himself through his teaching and the occasional donation from grateful families. Years passed, and James's reputation grew. He became known as the Ghost Whisperer, the man who could help veterans find peace with their wartime experiences. Letters came from all over the country, from men who had heard his story and wanted to learn his methods. But James knew that his methods were not something that could be taught in a classroom or learned from a book. The spirit dance was a gift, a sacred trust that could only be passed on to those who were ready to receive it. It was during the winter of 1875 that James met him, a young cavalry officer named Lieutenant David Wells, who had been wounded in a skirmish with the Lakota the previous summer. Wells had been brought to the hospital in Philadelphia, his body healing, but his spirit broken by the things he'd seen and done. James recognized the signs immediately: the haunted eyes, the sleepless nights, the weight of guilt that seemed to press down on the young man's shoulders. He'd seen it in dozens of veterans, but there was something different about Wells, something that reminded him of his own journey years before. "I've heard about you," Wells said when James introduced himself. "They say you can help men like me find peace." "I can share what I've learned," James replied, "but the real work has to come from within you." Wells nodded, his young face etched with pain. "I've killed people, women, children. We were told they were hostiles, but they were just families trying to survive." James felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Tell me about it." Wells's story poured out, a tale of confusion and horror, of orders that seemed to make no sense, of violence that achieved nothing but more violence. He spoke of the faces that haunted his dreams, the voices that whispered his name in the darkness. "I can't escape them," Wells said. "They're always with me, always watching." "I know," James said quietly. "I've been where you are. And you found peace? I found something better. I found purpose." Over the following weeks, James worked with Wells, sharing the lessons he'd learned from the spirit dance. He taught the young officer about forgiveness, about the bonds between the living and the dead, about the possibility of redemption even for the most broken souls. Slowly, Wells began to heal. The nightmares faded, the guilt lifted, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter. But more importantly, He began to understand his role in the greater dance of life and death. "I want to help others," Wells said one evening as they sat in the hospital garden. "I want to share what you've taught me." James smiled, remembering his own words to many horses so many years before. "Then you're ready for the next step." "What next step?" "There's something I need to show you. Something I need to share with you." James arranged for leave from his teaching position and booked passage on a train heading west. Wells, now discharged from the army, traveled with him, curious about what James had in mind. They arrived in the Dakota Territory in late spring, the prairie alive with wildflowers and the promise of new life. James rented horses in Rapid City and led Wells into the wilderness, following trails that he remembered from his dreams. The amphitheater looked exactly as it had 10 years before, the red stone walls rising like a natural cathedral, the central fire pit cold and empty. But James could feel the presence of the spirits, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. "This is where it happened," James said, telling Wells the story of his first encounter with the spirit dance. "This is where I learned that healing is possible, that forgiveness is real." Wells listened with growing amazement, his eyes wide with wonder. "And you think the spirits will come again?" "I don't think," James said. "I know." They made camp in the amphitheater, building a fire as the sun set behind the Black Hills. As darkness fell, James began to sing, not the ancient Lakota songs he'd learned from many horses, but something new, something that came from his own heart. Wells joined in, his voice harmonizing with James's, their combined song rising into the night sky. And slowly, as the stars appeared overhead, the spirits began to gather. They came not as the warrior spirits of James's first vision, but as the souls of all those who had died in the long conflict between the white man and the Indian. Soldiers and warriors, women and children, all united in death, all seeking the same peace. Many horses appeared among them, his ancient face shining with joy. "You have learned well, young teacher," he said to James. "You have become what you were meant to be." "I've tried to honor what you taught me," James replied, "and you have succeeded. But now it is time for the next generation to carry on the work." The old man turned to Wells, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "You carry the weight of many deaths, young warrior. Are you ready to help them find their peace?" Wells nodded, his face shining with tears. "I'm ready." What followed was unlike anything James had experienced before. The spirit dance that night was not just about forgiveness and healing, it was about teaching, about passing on the sacred knowledge to a new generation. Wells learned not just the steps of the dance, but the deeper meanings behind them, the spiritual truths that could transform even the most wounded soul. As dawn approached, James felt a profound sense of completion. His work was not finished. It never would be, as long as there were souls in need of healing, but a new chapter was beginning. The spirit dance would continue, carried forward by those who understood its true purpose. "Thank you," he said to many horses as the spirits prepared to fade with the coming dawn. "Thank you," the old man replied. "You have honored the sacred trust we placed in you. The dance will continue, the healing will spread, and the bonds between the living and the dead will grow stronger." As the sun rose over the Black Hills, James and Wells stood together in the amphitheater, forever changed by what they had experienced. The sky above them was painted in shades of gold and crimson, but there was no sorrow in those colors now, only the promise of new beginnings. "What do we do now?" Wells asked. James smiled, feeling the presence of the spirits around them, no longer as haunting memories but as guides and teachers. "Now we go back to the world and share what we've learned. We help others find their peace, their purpose, their connection to the great dance of life and death, together. And when our time comes, we'll pass the knowledge on to others, just as it was passed to us." They rode back to civilization, two men united by a shared understanding of the sacred and the mysterious. Behind them, the amphitheater settled into silence. But it was not empty. It was filled with the promise of future ceremonies, future healings, future moments when the veil between worlds would grow thin and the spirit dance would begin again. James Morrison lived for another 30 years, traveling throughout the country, sharing his gift with those who needed it most. David Wells became his constant companion, his partner in the work of healing. Together, they helped hundreds of veterans find peace with their wartime experiences, teaching them the lessons of forgiveness and the power of letting go. When James finally passed away in 1905, Wells was at his bedside, along with dozens of the men they had helped over the years. His last words were about the dance, about the continuing cycle of healing and hope that would outlast any individual life. "The dance never ends," he whispered. "It continues in every act of love, every moment of grace, every choice to forgive rather than condemn. Remember that, and the spirits will always be with you." Wells carried on the work for another 20 years, training a new generation of healers, passing on the sacred knowledge to those who were ready to receive it. And when his time came, he too passed peacefully, surrounded by the souls he had helped to heal. The spirit dance continues to this day, though few recognize it for what it is. It can be found in the work of therapists who help veterans cope with trauma, in the forgiveness offered by families to those who have wronged them, in the quiet moments when the living and the dead find peace together. It is a dance that knows no boundaries of race or creed, no divisions of past or present. It is the eternal rhythm of healing, the sacred song of souls seeking redemption, the endless cycle of death and rebirth that connects all living things. And sometimes, when the veil between worlds grows thin, when the spirits of the dead call out for peace, the dance begins again in earnest. In hidden places, in sacred moments, in the hearts of those who understand that true healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from making peace with it. The spirit dance lives on, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the eternal hope that even the most broken souls can find their way home. And at dawn, when the sky weeps tears of joy for the healing that has taken place, the spirits smile and whisper their ancient song of peace, knowing that the dance will continue as long as there are souls in need of healing. Because in the end, we are all dancers in the great ceremony of life and death, all seeking the same thing: forgiveness, understanding, and the peace that comes from knowing we are not alone in our struggles. The spirit dance is our birthright, our sacred trust, our eternal hope, and it will never end, will.